Episode 107 of Stand Up welcomes historian Kenneth C. Davis and the host of the QAnon Anonymous Conspiracy Debunking Podcast, Travis View. I'm Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Let's roll, Tim. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for checking me out today. This is episode 107 and lots to talk with you about here at the top. I'm very excited that I tried this new idea and sat down with one of my guests in front of a live audience on a video link. If you are a subscriber, you can join me this week where I will try to get another great guest and favorite of yours to join me so that you can ask questions. All you have to do to join us is subscribe for a paid subscription. The show airs daily. I post, I should say. It doesn't really air. It's a podcast, so you post. And every day I post a new podcast, a new episode with 2 or 3 or more guests. And I have Ken Davis, my favorite historian, sitting down with me today in front of a live audience on a video link. And we took questions. We had a great time. And I would love to have you join us. So just sign up with a paid subscription. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes or patreon.com/Pete Dominic for as little as $5. You can join us and ask questions to the guests and have your voice heard. Everybody has their voice heard here on the podcast in so many different ways. I got an amazing email from a guy named Brady who said, I cannot begin to explain what your shows are for me. For the last 10 years, I've ridden my bike to work and listened to you almost every day. And yes, 10 years is pre-app, which means I had a portable XM radio that recorded your show every day, and I listened on demand. Hell, maybe I was the first on-demand listener. Brady, thank you so much. He says, Pete, you bring a calm voice and such smart guests. I love your outlook on helping promote your guests and celebrating them as they become popular in their own right. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for 10 years of smart, funny, and sanity. Keep doing what you're doing, I promise. I'll up my subscription from $5 to $10 when I'm getting paid again. Brady, thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. I really do. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. A lot of folks are editing their subscriptions up to pay more every month, which is amazing, and I really appreciate it. This is my job now. This podcast each and every day. I'm doing it. Today, I've got 2 great guests talking about conspiracy theories with Travis View, who hosts this great podcast with 2 other guys called QAnon Anonymous. That's coming up. You really don't want to miss that. It's a great conversation. This is a really very interesting, fascinating, smart, passionate guy who comes highly recommended from a listener named Derek, who was on last week, who lost his mom to these conspiracy theories. So I reached out to Travis View. We had a great talk, and that is coming up after my conversation with Kenneth C. Davis, which was so much fun to do, and I'm looking forward to doing it with another guest this week. So I hope that you will join us with a paid subscription. You can be a part of the audience. You can ask questions. You can ask answers. So much going on in the news. Really sad to see that Fred Willard died. I was a big fan of Fred Willard. He was 86 years old. You know him from Everybody Loves Raymond and Modern Family. You probably, maybe you don't know about this. I just read about this tonight. Tropical Storm Arthur headed toward the Outer Banks. Good luck to anybody on the Atlantic coast. As well as heart goes out to the 11 firefighters injured in a explosion in downtown Los Angeles. Did you hear that the House passed a $3 trillion coronavirus relief package? It's going nowhere in the Senate. Did you hear that JCPenney has filed for bankruptcy and that the German Pro Soccer League is back, albeit without spectators? What's the first league that's going to come back in the U.S.? I haven't been paying attention much to sports. Spain has recorded fewer than 100 coronavirus deaths for the first time in 2 months. That's good news. One of the hardest hit nations. They recorded 87 coronavirus-related deaths within the last 24 hours on Sunday. President Obama this weekend, along with a whole bunch of other celebrities, gave a commencement speech, and he also criticized the folks in charge. A lot of them aren't even pretending to be in charge, he said. And the president, in response to that, I'm surprised he didn't go crazy on Twitter. But in response, he just said, he was a grossly incompetent president. That's what Trump said about Obama. Sure. In the meantime, the president is firing anybody who provides any oversight over his administration, including the inspector general of the State Department, a guy named Steve Linick. he was fired. And now the story is because maybe they were looking into Mike Pompeo, who is an asshole of epic proportions, because he was having staffers like walk his dog and do all kinds of weird personal tasks that apparently he's not supposed to be doing. So there you are. You're caught up on just some of the news, some of the crazy. And I wanted to read these tweets from the great Jay Tapper. I like Jay Tapper. He's a pretty good reporter as far as journalists go on cable news. I think he's one of the best. And he's talking about yesterday, tweeting about the Trump and his administration and their unprecedented smear campaign against their rivals. He wrote, President Trump and his team are launching an unprecedented smear campaign against rivals, leveling wild and false allegations against critics in the media and politics, ranging from the bizarre conspiracy theories to spreading lies about pedophilia and even murder. These smear campaigns are unmoored from reality. They're deranged and indecent and seem designed, at least in part, to distract from the horrific death, health, and economic crisis caused by the pandemic. The pandemic, which impacts you, is what we will continue to focus on. Tapper getting a lot of attention for those tweets, and so is Trump for all of his craziness as well. That's all I wanted to say here at the top, other than I had a great weekend. I hope you had a great weekend if you're listening to this podcast on Monday. Thank you very much. Tell all of your friends about it. Here doing it daily, and got together with a whole bunch of subscribers, 50, I think, altogether. And we sat down and listened to the great Kenneth C. Davis, my favorite historian. And here is that conversation right now. And stay, because you're going to definitely not want to miss my conversation with Travis View on conspiracy theories after it. I am so excited to see all of your faces, and I am really, really excited to try something new and to have an interview like this live and to have a whole bunch of people here. It's just like being on the radio live, and it's very exciting to have you here. And I'll turn it over for questions, but I am just overwhelmed by the fact that you all join me here on a Thursday night. Thank you very much. But most importantly, thank you to our guest, who is a longtime guest on the show and one of my favorite people that has ever been on the show. I love talking to and learning from him. His Don't Know Much About History book series, and he's got a new one coming out, everybody, for pre-order, available now, out in October. Strongman. My light is ruining it. There it is. To have him here to try this out for the first time ever, my first guest, ladies and gentlemen, Kenneth C. Davis. Everybody, put your hands together, even though I've muted you, so he can see it. Let's get some energy in this Zoom room, everybody. Come on, Randolph. Come on. What's the problem down there? Who I'm going to call you out. Benny Alexander. I did not see you clapping. Poor Brock. His hands are broken. Okay, Ken, hi.
Hello, Pete. Good evening, and let's do this.
Let's roll, Tim. All right. So lots to talk with you about, but of course, you wrote a really important book that is sadly relevant, and we've got to talk about how the Spanish flu in 2018 relates to what we are dealing with now. And the title of that book is Deadlier Than War, More Deadly Than War. You've got that one. Could you hold that up? Because I don't have that available. Everybody who needs to get this. There it is. More Deadly Than War. Sir, too bad that we have to talk about that book, but we do.
The book came out 2 years ago in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu and the end of World War I. They happened simultaneously. They're completely connected. The most deadly pandemic in American history, and the most deadly worldwide pandemic since the Middle Ages and the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It was a pandemic that was completely related to the war. Started in the United States in army bases, where kids were going off to train to go to the killing fields of Europe in March of 1918. When the army went across to Europe, when the 1 million doughboys, as they were called, landed in Europe, they brought the flu with them, and it exploded across Europe at that time. And one of the impacts of it was that people in Spain got very sick. And this is just to explain the name.
Hold on a second. somebody.
The Hells Angels are going past.
Oh, is that you? Is that your apartment?
That is my apartment.
Oh, I thought it was somebody that's not on mute. Let me just make sure you're on mute, everybody. But of course, Ken is in New York City where he lives, and that was a bunch of motorcycles going by, interrupting. How dare they?
I guess so. I mean, I live in the West Village, and I don't know who that was just now, but it's been really quiet down here, of course, like it is everywhere else, especially in Lower Manhattan. But for some reason, the motorcycle squad seemed to just go by. So I was talking about how this became the Spanish flu. Spain was a neutral nation in World War I. Just to go back, World War I starts in August of 1914. The United States stays out of it for the next 3 years. Woodrow Wilson, who's the president, runs for re-election in 1916 on a peace platform. He says he kept us out of war. He did not want anything to do with this mess in Europe. But by April of 1917, the United States declares war on Germany, and it took nearly a year to be ready to commit troops to go to Europe because we had no army and no navy. But they're going to get 4 million soldiers ready to go to Europe. They did that at these army bases spread all around the country. And in March of 1918, that's where the first recorded cases of the Spanish flu started. Then those kids, those soldiers got onto trains, crowded trains. Then they got onto crowded ships, went to Europe. 1 million of these doughboys land in Europe by May of 1918, and it explodes across Europe. Spain was not in the war. It was a neutral nation. And because it was a neutral nation, it did not censor the newspapers to the degree that newspapers were censored in the combatant nations. And censorship is an important issue then as it is today. So the first report of a real epidemic anywhere in Europe, a European capital, comes out of Madrid. And so that's where the name Spanish flu comes from. It had nothing to do with starting in Spain. The Spanish, by the way, called it the Naples soldier. In Germany, they called it the Russian pest. In Russia, they called it the Chinese fever. Are you getting a picture here that people like to blame these disastrous epidemics on somebody else? And so it was true 1918 and certainly true today.
Yeah.
This is an important piece of the history. The flu came in March of 1918, spread around America, spread across Europe. Then it seemed to slack off. Flu season was over. Summertime didn't seem so bad. Everybody went back to war as usual. In September 1918, the flu came back, first in Boston at a military pier. Sailors brought it back. Whether they came from Europe, we're not even sure. They brought it back to Boston, spread around Boston. Then it went to an army camp outside of Boston called Fort Devens. Sailors from those Boston ships went to Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, to the Great Lakes Naval Station. And now it exploded in a much more deadly, lethal wave, a second wave. And the most deadly period for the Spanish flu was actually in the fall of 1918. And so why is that important? Because we've heard people say, well, this is going to go away like a miracle in April, thinking that this is just like some flu season that's over. That's what, a lot of people thought 102 years ago. And then it came back and it was much more deadly, much more contagious, much more lethal. It had probably mutated and it exploded. 675,000 Americans died of the flu and complications from the flu. That's probably the lowball number. In a year, we had a bad flu year a few years ago. About 60,000 people died. This was 675,000 people in a year. That's more than the soldiers who died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam put together. It's about the number of people who have died of HIV and AIDS in 30 years. This was in 1 year. The American population back then was about a third of what it is now. So just do simple multiplication. 700,000 roughly times 3 is 2.1 million. If we had the Spanish flu today, 2.1 million people would die. And they died gruesomely. It was a terrible death. These are people who they were racked by pain, high fevers. flat on their back. You couldn't breathe. Your lungs were filled with fluid. You turned blue. It's a medical condition called cyanosis. In fact, before they called it Spanish flu, people called it the purple death. There's a doctor who said that the people are in New York City. The people are coming in. They're blue as huckleberries. They're spitting blood and they're dying. This was a level of death that had never been seen in America before. The bodies were stacked like cordwood, the doctors would say, whether it was in hospitals or in army bases. And so this was a dreadful thing. And it was all because the war was going on. Troops moving around the country, shortages of doctors, shortages of medicine, the fact that ships were sailing all over the world and crews were then infected every port that they landed in. So this became a worldwide pandemic that killed between 50 and 100 million people, again, in the space of a little more than a year. And it changed history.
All right.
But then it was kind of forgotten.
So I wasn't planning on going to questions, but Justin, if you're going to throw your hand up like that, it looks like you have a question. And if you have a question that you want me to ask, you can also toss it in the chat. But did you have your hand up for a question, or why were you wait? Okay, Justin, I'll take you off mute.
Yes, I did. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? So the big question I had, is there any known information about like the lead time of like showing symptoms to like coming down with this, or like being infected to showing symptoms compared to like what COVID is and what the Spanish flu version of this is?
Yeah, not to mention, I also thank you. Good question. I don't know if you know about the health component there, Ken, but what about social distancing? What about just the communication that they had? You know, now you can launch a tweet and say this is where you go for a test, or, you know, they have just much more technology. What do you think? What do you got?
Right. There are a couple. It's a really good question. And there's so many fascinating aspects of this that relate to what things were like then that still relate to our world today. So let me take a couple aspects of that. First of all, the word flu, influenza, had been around for more than 2,000 years. It goes back to ancient Greece. Hippocrates had described flu symptoms. The word influenza actually comes from the Italian, from Latin, meaning the influence of the heavens, because they thought it was seasonal, that something about the seasons brought the flu. But in 1918, they didn't know what a virus was. They had seen bacteria, but no one had seen a virus yet because a virus was too small to be seen by the microscopes of that time. So nobody really understood what a virus was. Was this some kind of pneumonia? Was it related to bacteria? Bacteria and viruses are very different. Antibiotics work on bacteria, but not on viruses. But they didn't even have antibiotics in 1918. So the science was very different. What they knew was that they understood that the flu comes and it kills people and it could be very deadly. They called it things like the grip also, different names for the flu. But nobody had ever seen flu that was quite like this, particularly because, like these soldiers, young soldiers who were healthy farm boys when they checked into camp in places like Kansas or Boston, they were flat on their backs and dying within hours. And it was very sudden. It was very quick. You could get sick right away, very, very quickly, very, very suddenly, and die very suddenly. And as I said, they were sometimes just choking on their own body fluids. So it was a pretty gruesome death. And there was very little warning and very little to do about it because they still didn't understand what this actually was, Pete. To the question, you sort of brought in the question of social distancing. They certainly understood that this flu and viruses in general love a crowd. And so they understood that the best way to deal with this was things that we do today. Quarantining, getting this, they took the first soldier who got sick and they put him in quarantine. He happened to be a cook in this camp in Kansas. And so there was really no quarantine. He had been serving hundreds of soldiers, and they started to stream in. But a lot of cities did begin to practice what we would call social distancing. And the cities, again, this goes back to the idea that there was a wave in March, kind of subsides, March, April, May. kind of subsides, comes back with a vengeance in September. Now, they saw Boston, New York, Philadelphia have really, really bad outbreaks. And so places like San Francisco and St. Louis did what we would call flatten the curve. And they did the social distancing. And they were very successful at first. But then, again, good lessons for today, they relaxed too soon. And in both cities, St. Louis and San Francisco, big spikes up of infections and deaths because they allowed the city to reopen too soon.
I want to know also what the economic effect was of for the Spanish flu. But what about testing? Our president, today said if we didn't have so many tests, we wouldn't have so many cases.
Yeah, and if we didn't have pregnancy tests, there wouldn't be so many babies.
It was it was the most horrifying, embarrassing, and hilariously stupid thing I think he might have ever said. I don't even think he realized it. But nonetheless, did they have testing? Did they know then?
No, of course. Again, they didn't. They had never seen a virus. Viruses are infinitesimally smaller than bacteria. Bacteria had been seen for a long time.
Oh, wow.
They understood how to fight bacteria. Places like London had great outbreaks of cholera, which is a bacterial infection. It's usually from dirty water, usually from poor sanitation. Great story of the defeat of cholera in London in the late 19th century in Dickensian London. This guy figures out that there's one water pump that's creating all this problem of cholera. And it turns out eventually that the sewage is flowing into the water pump that people were getting their water from. They closed down that pump and ended the cholera. And so that was a major move forward. Things like syphilis had already begun to be treated with so-called magic bullets. But again, because they couldn't see a virus, they didn't understand how infinitesimal it was. They certainly didn't understand the genetics. There was certainly no testing for it in 1918. A virus wouldn't be seen until the 1930s. There wouldn't be a vaccine for viruses like influenza until the 1940s. So the science was way, way behind. In 1918, about all a doctor could do was give you some aspirin. And this is an interesting point of the story, too. Aspirin was made by Bayer. Bayer was a German company. It was the wonder drug of the 20th century. Americans widely thought that Bayer was tainted, that the Germans had done something to Bayer aspirin. There are ads you can see in 1918 showing Bayer taking out ads that say a Bayer aspirin is safe. It's made on the banks of the Hudson by Americans. So we've always done this also. Besides, the censorship and lies, there's propaganda. So there was a belief that the Germans had unleashed this on America. There was a belief that U-boats, the German submarines, had poisoned the water supply, or Bayer aspirin was tainted. So that was also part of the fear, the lies, and the propaganda that's helped spread this pandemic. And that's another important lesson for today.
Did the president at the time suggest that people should inject disinfectant into their bodies?
He did not, because they didn't really have, this is the early times of disinfectants. There were, as I said, there were no antibiotics. Lysol was certainly around, but nobody was suggesting to inject it into your body. No kidding there. No, and I don't want to be glib about it. It's a reprehensible, irresponsible idea. But they didn't really know what to do. And certainly the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, this is an important point also. I was talking about how the war is completely tied up in the spread of the flu. But the war was all that the president and the federal government cared about at that moment. The fact that there was a major pandemic striking the American public was really not a major consideration for the federal government in 1918. The whole driving force of the federal government at that time was to get America into the war win the war. And one of the ways they did that, and this is an important aspect of the story too, was by the promotion of something called Liberty loans. These were war bonds that you could buy for, a very small amount of money. But this wasn't a casual thing. This was a full-scale media marketing propaganda campaign to force everyone to buy these bonds, these Liberty loans. And if you didn't do it, you were suspect. Your loyalty was called into question if you didn't. When these guys came into your office and they would come in and give a speech, a 4-minute speech about how everybody has to do their part. If you didn't do your part, you had a social price to pay for that. They would question your loyalty, your patriotism. The most famous case of this was a parade in Philadelphia in September of 1918. 200,000 people go into the streets to see a parade to sell Liberty loans. The health department knew there was already an epidemic around. They were told not to allow this. They let it go on. 2 days after that parade, and there were 7 people were packed 6 and 7 deep on the sidewalk. 2 days after that parade, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. That's how sudden and quick and virulent this contagion was in 1918. 15,000 people died in a matter of weeks in Philadelphia. It was one of the hardest hit cities of all. And they specifically knew that they shouldn't have this parade, but they did it anyway. They knew that viruses love crowds, that influenza loves a crowd, but they let it happen. And so the same thing with the president and the military heads. They were advised to stop bringing troops into the training camps, to stop recruitments, because the training camps had become real hotbeds of the problem. And then these soldiers were then getting on ships and going to Europe and spreading it further. So everything about the war and the war effort was counter to stopping the flu. And also remember, there was no federal government then as we understand it today. There was no CDC. There was no NIH. There was a public health service. They were largely responsible for checking immigrants coming into the country for diseases.
Was there an Andrew Cuomo and an Anthony Fauci?
There were certainly local leaders who were much more effective in dealing with things. And there was an Anthony Fauci of the day, doctors and the Surgeon General who were trying desperately to do something. But again, the science was just not there yet. But they and things that they were telling the government to do, quarantine and stop sending troops over and stop having big parades to sell war bonds, were not the priorities of the government. So there are 3 lessons, in my opinion, 3 really big lessons. Lies, censorship, and propaganda helped spread the Spanish flu. There's no question about that. Ignoring science was really lethal. They didn't pay attention to the science in Philadelphia. Woodrow Wilson didn't pay attention to the doctors who said, don't send any more troops to Europe. These boats are filled with sick men. They kept doing it because they wanted to win the war. So ignoring science. And then lastly, it's the question we're having today, misplaced priorities. The priorities were the war effort. So that was either sending troops over to Europe or selling these bonds, and both things continued to spread the Spanish flu. And it was really a devastating thing. Economically, Philadelphia was on the brink of, complete economic disaster. The flu, the only saving grace was that it kind of burnt through so quickly, then it was over in November. It made another round later in the winter of 1919, a 3rd wave, which is something else we have to think about. And we heard this, if you heard the doctor talking today, Dr. Bright, he was talking about this winter being dreadful. If we get this coronavirus and seasonal influenza combined, we could have the worst winter in modern history.
Well, that's great.
I don't take those things lightly, and I'm not fear-mongering here, but we do have to say this is what history tells us, and we should really pay attention.
All right. And you're not one to fear-monger. I appreciate that. We've got about 47 people here hanging out with us tonight. Ken, and thank you all for joining us. I definitely want to turn it over to folks. If you have any question about what we've been talking about, the Spanish flu, Spanish pandemic, then by all means. But if you have history questions in general, I'd love to hear from them too. And because Joe, you sent me, so I said, I see all your hands up. I'm going to go to Joe real quick, but Joe sent me, Ken, like 47 questions for you today, and they alternate between serious, very good questions and preposterous, borderline insulting questions. But I will ask one of them just to give it a little levity. Joe, you want to know if Professor Davis is wearing socks, and if so, what color and pattern? Is that right, Joe?
That is correct, Pete. Thank you so much.
I am wearing socks. They happen to be made in America, darn tough socks from Vermont.
Ends up being an amazing question. Joe, do you have a thoughtful, serious history question? Because you included a lot in your 7,500 word email to me today, which seemed like you didn't get a lot done.
No, I did not. Kenneth, I think the work you do is fantastic. And I really do admire the amount of time and effort to attention detail you put into your books. It really
have you pre-ordered Strongman yet? Have you done that yet?
I've read this twice.
Very nice.
I've gone through the two Don't Know Much history books twice. They're fantastic. I do recommend it all the time. But I just want to say thank you for being a big part of the show, and you are one of my favorite guests that do come on. Well, so I love hearing about you.
You asked that. I'm taking your question there then. In your great book, In the Shadow of Liberty, which you just held up. Hold it up again, Joe. You write,
yes, of course.
You talk about the presidents and founding fathers who owned slaves, although flawed, are considered honorable. What do you think of the current administration or conservative movement? Flawed, yet honorable? Well, you're not going to get Ken to get that political.
I know. Sorry, try.
Ken?
Where do I go here with this? Look, I generally talk about history in terms of what we can learn from it and what we should learn from it and what we can bring to understanding the present. I certainly have my own political opinions. I tend to try and veer away from getting into that too much. But obviously I have to say that I think that especially this response to this pandemic has been incompetent, incoherent, immoral, ignorant. So I could keep going down the list. This has been one of the worst performances by an administration, certainly in my lifetime and in my history, in my study of presidents. It would be difficult to find a worse case. And I say that having given George Bush an F in Don't Know Much About the American Presidents for his handling of both the economy and the war in Iraq. No, I'm reluctant to get too far into the weeds of politics here. We're talking about history. I think there are some important lessons. But I also think that there's a bigger issue, and talking a little bit about strongman, which is the rise of five dictators and the fall of democracy, is very much part of this conversation, as far as I'm concerned. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Saddam Hussein are the five leaders I profile in this book. It's important to understand that Mussolini and Hitler did not take power with a line of tanks at the head of an army. They were both put in power in constitutional democracies. Democracy does not die in darkness. I'm sorry, Washington Post. It usually dies in broad daylight while millions of people are cheering. And we have seen, and this is not just about the last 3 years, we have seen a real decline and demise in democracy around the world and in the United States over the last 2 decades in particular. Goes back even farther than that. It has to do with gerrymandering. It has to do with the bitter bipartisan spirit that has really destroyed any sense of congressional compromise. It has to do with voter suppression, which is, again, not to be partisan about this, but you have to really put this as a strategy that was taken up by the Republican Party because they could see the demographics, that this is a party of white, old Christian people, and there are soon going to be a minority in this country of white, old Christian people. So how do you retain power? You suppress the vote of those people who aren't white, Christian, and old. So that very, very calculated suppression of votes has certainly impacted our democracy. Now, we have not been a very good nation about voting throughout history. In fact, presidential turnout is usually not much more than 50%. If we get to 60%, everyone throws a party. This is a country that half the people usually sit out. In midterms, it's even worse than that. That's sad and it's dangerous, because the story that I tell in Strongman is about how quickly democracy can vanish overnight if we allow it to. And it really is up to us.
I just lost 6 old white Christian subscribers, Ken. Thanks a lot for that. Really appreciate it. Kevin. Kevin, you're on the air. Hey, buddy.
Right on, man. Hey, what's going on?
Namaste, my friend.
Hey, first time caller, long time listener.
Dude.
I always wanted to say that.
Well,
yeah, right on.
Now that we've gotten past that awkward
Ken,
moment, I just want to say, before you saying this is the first time we're talking, I just want to say this guy right here has been so thoughtful for so long. We've yet to talk on the phone or anywhere. This is the first time we're connecting this way, but you just sent my wife a Facebook message, which was unbelievably thoughtful about, how much you're rooting for us. And it was very, very kind.
Right, I'm rooting for both of you guys, man. It's a tough time,
Well, you're a great guy, and you've had a really interesting, the adversity that you've overcome. Now to Ken, your question. Enough about us.
Yeah.
We'll have a love affair later.
Well, Ken, first of all, I'm so happy that you're here. I mean, I've been listening to you on Pete's show for years, and I'll hold up this book.
The best. Oh, right. So good. Civil War. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Civil War stuff, which I knew nothing about. And, thank you for that. But anyway, so getting back to the Spanish flu, and I hate calling it that. I'm going to call it the 1918 flu, because like you said, it's arguable that it came from the U.S.
I just got 2 new Spanish subscribers. Thank you for that thoughtfulness.
I mean, and the only reason Spain got labeled with it was because they were honest in their press, right? So anyway, I just finished listening to a book from John Barry on the Great Influenza, and it's a fantastic book. I will definitely be getting your book. But what you brought up here, what came into my mind on all this is the parallel that's going on right now. And it's scary how it's eerily the same thing happening with the propaganda. At that time, the medical field in the United States was just evolving. But the doctors at that time were trying to get the message across to Woodrow Wilson, who basically said, I'm not listening to this because it's not in our best interest. And there was an anti-malarial drug that at the time, I think it was a quinine or something. They were trying to get people to use that drug to treat the flu. There was really no clinical trials, so the doctors couldn't get anything going here. But I guess my question to you would be, where can people and why don't people look at history? Because we learn from history. So what's frustrating is, why can't people look at history now and come to those conclusions that we had from 1918 and learn from those mistakes? And why can't that be shared in our media? And that's what bothers me. There's so much information here that our media could be sharing. And that's what frustrates me, I guess.
I'll take the media question. Come on.
Yeah.
And
you're not
it's
media,
money.
What I call yeah.
No, now I'm independent media. I answer to you guys. You guys can hold my feet to the fire right now, but media is about making money. And now let's ask a doctor, because you're asking him a psychology question. Why don't we learn from history?
It's a question. Obviously,
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, sure. Right on.
Thank you for when he said first time caller, I thought he was going to ask me about the Mets or, the Knicks.
It's a sports college. Yeah.
When I wrote Don't Know Much About History, which I'm shocked to tell you came out 30 years ago, originally. It's been revised and updated and expanded many times since then, but the book is 30 years ago. And all the problems that we say people don't understand history, it was true 30 years ago, and it was probably true 130 years ago or 100 years ago as well. So we, as a nation, we have not done a good job of teaching history. For a long time, we taught it as, kind of bedtime stories and patriotic stories, the cherry tree and crossing crossing the Delaware in the boat, and Abe Lincoln chopping down something else. But these stories, and Paul Revere making this ride, these stories were meant to make us feel good about the country, but they didn't really teach us history. More problematic in the last 20 years or so is that history teaching has really been pushed to the back burner in the elementary through high school levels. And I don't want to get into a whole diatribe about what's wrong with education right now, but this largely comes out of things like all child left behind, and
Race to the Top, and competing.
Top. Yeah. All of these things that have forced schools to go into standardized testing to be able to get federal funding have really made us not teach history. Then there's been this kind of fadism to go to STEM learning. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so that teaching history, teaching civics, which is a component of what is now called social studies, teaching geography, teaching economics, are just seen as soft things that you don't have to do. And obviously, I think that that's not only sad, it's very dangerous. And that's one of the reasons that we have such a poor track record of civic engagement in this country. So, yes, absolutely, there are really important lessons to learn from history. Part of the problem is we fight over which history we're telling. So when you hold up my book about the Civil War, I can tell you that that's not a book that a lot of people in other parts of the country would want to hear about, because it presents a view of the Civil War that's very much at odds with the lost cause Confederacy version of the Civil War that was taught in this country for a very, very long time.
Yeah, there's a lot. Your books in down south are used as kindling. I think.
You still today hear people talk about states' rights, and it's just not founded in any history. And a lot of people, much better and smarter and more grounded historians than me, have been really working at this for a long time.
Oh, they don't exist. Name those historians. I don't believe them. Ken, let me cut you off only to get to a couple more questions here. And I see everybody's hands up. Tom, are you ready? Tom? And I see Dan's got his hand. Tom Reese, you have been unmuted. You are on the air with Professor Ken Davis.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for taking my question, and it's good to have you on, Mr. Davis. So I actually live in Wisconsin, and as you probably have heard, the Supreme Court here had basically knocked down the governor's stay-at-home order. And I'm wondering a little bit, is there anything of precedence that you could probably compare this to that happened in the 1918 flu? I worry that, this patchwork of, I think I read a little bit of that patchwork of policies is not going to be effective. And I just want to hear your thoughts and see if there's anything that we can compare and kind of learn from this from before.
Thank you very much, Tom in Wisconsin.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think the best case, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier on, is the best case is the story of what happened in San Francisco and St. Louis in 1918. Both cities had seen what was happening on the East Coast, and because the flu tended to move east to west, although eventually it's just spread everywhere and started to come in from all different directions because of seaports, San Francisco had a very, very strict quarantine and a very strict mask law. You got arrested, you got fined for being a mask slacker in San Francisco in 1918. There are pictures of people in San Francisco They moved courts outside. So there were actual trials going on outside in San Francisco. They saw the decline that happened sort of in November of 1918. It kind of happened right after the war ended. Remember, the war ends on November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. People thought, oh, the war is over, let's go celebrate. And hundreds of thousands of people went out into the streets in places like San Francisco and Philadelphia to celebrate the end of the war. Guess what? Bam, big spike up. So big public gatherings brought about a second spike in these cities that had been really successful. St. Louis and San Francisco are the best two examples of them. They had been much lower in both infections and deaths than Philadelphia, which was probably the worst city. Boston was one of the worst cities. But then they relaxed too soon. So it's a perfect parallel to what we're talking about today. This virus in 1918, just to be clear again, was influenza. This is a coronavirus. They are different. They're both viruses, obviously, but have very, very different impacts.
I'm trying to think of something that we might be celebrating around November 4th and want to run out in the street, but I think we know better. Let me go to Dan, who is in California. Dan, you're on the air with Ken Davis.
Hi, Ken. My question to you is, and I have a little pie chart behind me. You can see
such an unbelievable nerd. It's unparalleled.
That the statistic of how much we have relative to everyone else. My question is, in the past pandemic or pandemics, though I doubt that there were too many statistics before 1917 or whatever, but have we ever had a situation where we have so many cases in one part of the world compared to the rest of the world? Because that has to do something with how we're handling it. It's got to.
In 1918, I'm not quite sure if let me just try and answer in the most general way. In 1918, there were no hot spots. It was everywhere. And certainly some places suffered more than others. They tended to be the places that had the highest mortality rates were places that had no experience potentially with influenza. So, for instance, a boat lands in the South Pacific and on an island, and within 2 weeks, 25% of the island was dead. That's not 25% of the people who got sick were dead. 25% of the island was dead. There were Alaskan villages, and I write about them in More Deadly Than War. It's a really central kind of story of what happens with the flu. A village in Alaska, 78 people are in the village. A missionary comes. They had never had influenza like this introduced into this. And I think 70 of the 78 people were dead in 3 days. Oh. So this was something that touched every continent short of Antarctica, and seemed to have no respect for weather or climate or any of the things that you hear floated around about this virus. So no, it wasn't. There were no clusters here and there. Certainly in the United States, big cities, because viruses love crowds, big cities were hit the hardest. And the bigger the city and the more crowded the city, generally the more the higher the death rate. But again, it has to do a lot with the war. Now we're talking about meat factories today. In 1918, there were people going into shipyards, naval shipyards, or munitions factories, or places where they were turning out uniforms. So you had enormous numbers of people crowded into very, very tight quarters. The same thing with soldiers, barracks, where 50,000 men were in barracks that were designed for 30,000. So these were all hotspots for the spread of flu. And of course, if you're on a battlefield and you're in trenches or in a battlefield hospital and you're crowded together and you're in difficult, dire circumstances, and you don't have food and you don't have medicine, all those things contribute to the factors that led this flu to spread so widely in 1918. We don't have the wartime issues today that we had in 1918, but we do have the globalization. World War I was the first global war, and that's one of the reasons there was a global pandemic.
Well, we have a lot more globalization now with planes and everything. Quick follow-up, Dan. Hurry. I don't know how much time left we have with Dan. Go ahead.
What do you think the reason is that we have 1/3 of the cases? I mean, if you look at other pandemics, it's spread out based on population or where the hotspot was. What we have now, it's crazy.
For God's sakes, Dan, he's a historian, not an epidemiologist.
I'll answer that quickly as best as I can. I am not an epidemiologist. I mean,
nothing on my Shatner impression, anyone? Okay, go ahead.
Most of the cases, obviously, as we all know, are New York, New Jersey, Connecticut has been the vast majority of the cases in the United States, and that seems to be largely a question of if Governor Cuomo is to be understood correctly, and I think he's probably accurate, that this was the strain that came from Europe, not from China, that the airports in New York were getting millions of people who were then getting onto trains and getting onto subways and then spreading around. And then they were getting into cars and going to all other parts of the country. So millions of people passed through New York City before anybody realized that this was coming and that it was coming from Europe, not just from China. It was really a faulty assumption. And then a lot of things that should have been done weren't done. We did not. I mean, if you listen to Dr. Bright today, and the testimony was quite compelling. Yeah. I mean, there was really a lot of lost time in the early weeks and then months of this to have created this situation. And we did have the examples of Korea and China and Italy in the worst case to look at to try and forestall some of this, and it wasn't done.
Lastly, I want to go because I want to make sure we're respectful of Ken's time. Plus, I also want to spend like 10 minutes talking with folks about how things are changing in your communities and how people are getting a little bit more relaxed, and just see if we can have a little bit of a discussion about that. But let me get to Brock, who I think is in Missouri. You there, Brock? You're on with Kenneth C. Davis.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm here. Hi, Pete.
Hey, buddy.
Hi, Ken. Ken, you guys were talking population. In 1918, weren't we still basically an agrarian society? Or transforming after the Industrial Revolution, an agrarian society? About 50% was still living in rural areas, weren't we?
That is correct. 1920 is the tipping point for the big change in demographics. That was the year that more than half of the people were no longer living in the. So 1917, it's a long trend up to that point. But yes, that becomes the point at which people start moving to cities, and agriculture becomes more industrial. People move to cities for more opportunities. But it is a turning point in the demographics of the country. That was when we went from a majority farming country to a majority urban country slowly. And that's a very stark and simplistic approach to it. But yeah, and certainly the war had a lot to do with that. A place like Philadelphia had about under 1 million people before the war. Then they had this massive influx because all of a sudden Philadelphia had an enormous number of military defense contractors and factories building things from the war, and that's where people were going to get work. And then they were also moving there to go to bases that were nearby. So the war changed America very, very severely, and that's one of the reasons why, when the war and the flu were over, a fellow named Warren G. Harding, 100 years today, in fact, gave a speech, said that America wanted a return to normalcy. And I think that part of what you're saying is that people wanted that, to go back to what it was like before the war and before the pandemic. But there was a very popular song at the time, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Gay Paris? And that's, kind of what happened to America and to Americans. They had seen the world, they had seen cities, and so we went into what the so-called Roaring 20s. There was no going back to normal. The Roaring 20s had some wonderful things about them, like jazz and flappers and the Charleston, but it was also the era of Prohibition and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the most repressive immigration laws ever passed in America came in the 1920s, largely because the country said, we want to go back to normal. Normal means we want to keep those foreign things, those foreigners out of here, and we want what we had before. But there was no going back.
Final question. I'm going to take it. What do you think of our Attorney General, Fred Flintstone, saying that he thinks that history is written by the winners last week?
Generally, it has been. The winners change over time. So for a long time in America, the winners were, white European men who wrote the story about white European men. That began to change pretty radically in the 60s and 70s and continued with a generation of revisionism. And, there's nothing wrong about revisionism. We need revisionism. We need to tell an accurate, full story. We learn a lot as time goes by. So I think that, I would agree with that statement that history is written by winners. The winners do sometimes change over time. So I don't know, who will write the history of this particular administration, and we have a long ways to go yet, and a long, bumpy ride.
Well, I hope you do, because I'm glad you fell right for that question, because you actually have always written your work to include racial injustice and gender inequality, and that is why I was always a fan, because we didn't learn that where I grew up in history class, but you have always included that in all of your books, as well as in all of your talks with us. You always mention, as you did in the 20s, the rise of the Klan. That's not always the kind of thing that we would hear, but you're always sensitive and thoughtful to that. So I'm going to do something here. I'm going to try. I don't know if this will work, but I'm going to unmute everybody to give you an applause.
Right on.
What a way to spend your Thursday night, everybody, huh? Thank you so much, Ken. I hope everybody will consider, if not, go right out and pre-order Strongman. It comes out in hardcover in October. Ken, thank you. Nobody go away. I'll let Ken.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. I love you, Ken.
He's a rock star.
I'll just say one thing on the way out here. I kind of left the gallery view out.
Yeah.
It's distracting. I can see everybody. I had them turned off before because it's kind of distracting to try and talk and see all these faces.
Sure.
But this is a really handsome audience you have there. And
well, that's their ninth best. That's their ninth best quality. Really, I think the curiosity and intelligence, and as the great Taffy Therese said, I'm trying to find this piece from a chat from her. She says something like, a really fucking smart group of people we got here. So if you don't mind the language, Professor, I apologize.
No, I mean, today we had somebody say, in Congress that we're in deep shit. And, that's a pretty good way to end this note.
I'm uncomfortable hearing you curse. Ken, thank you very much. I appreciate you. We'll let you go, but thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It was a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we tried something here, Pete. Now we may never try it again, but we did. No,
you are the virgin here, and we appreciate you sacrificing yourself. And it was awesome. I'm surprised there weren't really any technical issues. It went really great. It's great to have you.
It was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed talking to everybody.
Thank you, buddy.
We could, do it in a room that we could all have a beer together. Maybe next time.
That will happen. Thank you, sir. Okay, that is Kenneth C. Davis and 50 of my newest, bestest friends. Thank you to all of you who joined me during the live conversation, and I look forward to doing that more. Go to don'tknowmuch.com, KennethC.com. Follow Ken on Twitter at Kenneth C. Davis right now. And if you have kids, he's going to be doing some online history courses. He's tweeting about it, Kenneth C. Davis, for all of the details. Okay, like I said, my next guest comes to me highly recommended from a regular listener, longtime listener named Derek, who lost his mom to all kinds of QAnon conspiracy theories. He says, you got to introduce and interview Travis View. He's one of 3 guys that host the QAnon Anonymous podcast, which is very well done. I highly recommend it. I had a billion questions for Travis View, and it was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and I look forward to continuing talking to him. Here is the conversation now. So Travis View is joining me, comes, like I said, highly recommended from another listener. Travis, welcome to Stand Up. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So listener Derek, longtime listener of mine, told me about you and your podcast and said I had to have you on. And the reason that he listens to you is because he lost his mom, basically, to QAnon. Hasn't talked to her for a year. And so my question to you is, how much of your audience are people that have lost family members, and how much are people, like me, who are really interested and curious and concerned about all this crazy stuff?
Yeah, it is a sort of like a combination of people who are simply interested in conspiracy theories and the conspiracy culture, but they aren't fully, radicalized. They're sort of interested in the culture, but they don't believe everything they hear, and so we kind of give people a way to sort of explore these beliefs. But we also have a big audience for our podcast, QAnon Anonymous, from people who do have family members who fell into QAnon. They were personally affected by these beliefs, because it's more than just conspiracy theory. It's sort of a culture in the community that sucks people in and radicalizes them and gets them to give up other things that are important to their life, like family and their career and like their other hobbies, in favor of just sort of posting and memeing all day in this digital war, because they consider themselves digital soldiers.
Yeah, they actually refer to themselves that way, right?
They call themselves, digital soldiers. They think that they are taking part in the Second American Revolution, and the battlefield is on Twitter now instead of Lexington and Concord.
As a comedian and just as kind of a dick, I generally want to ridicule them as a first reaction. But I wanted to get out in front of that reaction with you because, you have a nuanced view of these folks. You've been studying them, you know them, you've gone to actual rallies. Travis, how do you view the folks who have fallen for these terrible, pernicious, dangerous, life-ruining, altering conspiracy theories? How do you look at them? And do you also, are you against the ridicule of them to their face or even behind their backs the way I kind of do?
I mean, as a general policy, I don't believe that ridiculing the true believers is very productive. I might have fallen into it once or twice, in a moment of weakness, I'll admit. But I think that I reserve ridicule for 2 things: the sort of absurd things that they believe, which I think is fine. If someone believes something totally ridiculous, like JFK Jr. is alive, or the military is rescuing mole children who have been trapped under Central Park or something like that, then that's fine to ridicule those beliefs. But the people who believe it, the people who sincerely were duped into believing it, I see them more as sort of victims, and they're victims of people like the individuals behind Q, or the sort of the grifters who sort of push these theories. I think that I think a big mistake that people make is assuming that QAnon followers are entirely that they believe these things just because they're stupid, and I think that's really an oversimplification. Like, a lot of these people, they're very smart, but they are filled with grievances about like how the world works. They just feel profoundly on an instinctual level that something is wrong, and they want it to be corrected, as quickly as possible. And that
I feel that way.
That's true. Like, a lot of people feel that way. But the problem is that humans, they fall for like easy, quick solutions. And so Q comes along and they says that, well, all of your feelings about things being way, way wrong are valid. And also here's how it's going to happen. There's a plan to fix everything. And when people hear that there's a plan to sort of fix everything that's wrong about them, that can be very, very seductive. And it's surprisingly easy to fall into it. Sometimes we flatter ourselves into thinking that, that could never be me. We could never sort of get duped by that kind of thing. But like if the conditions are right, I think anyone can fall into this basically cult-like sort of pattern of thought.
I read a quote that you wrote again about the kind of the believers that you said when people get really invested in these beliefs, regardless of how demonstrably false or delusional they are, they don't let them go because they don't believe in it for rational reasons. They believe in it because it fills an emotional void in your life. Can you expand on that? What is that void, and how does this fill it? These beliefs.
Well, I mean, I feel people need to feel that, especially people who feel like things are profoundly wrong. They need the feeling of justice. If things are very, very unjust, they need to feel like justice is coming soon, because it's just psychically almost intolerable to believe that it's never coming. And they also need to believe that the world is going to get better, or that they also need significance, personal significance. Right. A lot of people, they feel like they don't have any real kind of input into sort of the political system. Like they are essentially politically powerless. And for a lot of us schlubs, I mean, we are, if you don't have a lot of money to donate and the only thing that you can offer is, your vote, you could feel really disenfranchised and simply looked over. And so this is a way to give a lot of people who feel powerless, or maybe genuinely are powerless, a way to feel like they are being part of something huge and massive and historical and transformative. And if you are someone who's really craving purpose and you're not getting it from the traditional routes, let's say your career or your religion or your relationship, something a little bit more personal that might make you feel like you are significant and you're working towards something meaningful, then this can be a substitute. This can sort of fill that void where other things aren't working.
And everything you just said is applied throughout probably human history in terms of the psychology and the sociology of it. But it's the internet and social media was a game changer for spreading these beliefs, just an accelerant.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the social media is that obviously it's a power, in many ways, powerful, wonderful, exciting, cool tool. I mean, I've loved social media for many years, yeah. But it also enables people to spin any kind of wild theory or disinformation that they want, and you can just be a guy and you can get a massive audience of people who believe your nonsense, and that I think can wind up being very, very dangerous.
So let's dig into some of the actual theories and who believes them and how much of an effect they've had. But again, staying a little bit more broad, I don't feel like that there is a conspiracy fringe anymore. I used to think that. Now I think the fringe is mainstream, and I'm wondering how you would frame it. But as long as the president of the United States is one of the leading conspiracy theorists in the country, and I was actually at the RNC for SiriusXM back in 2015 in Cleveland, and I asked Trump supporters what they thought about his belief in, I think I mentioned, 3 conspiracy theories: that Obama, wasn't born here, that climate change was all a hoax, and that vaccines cause autism. Those are 3 theories that Trump has either overtly spread and repeated, or at least suggested towards. And now he's on the record of retweeting certain QAnon accounts or mentions of it, and he's constantly making shit up out of whole cloth. Obamagate most recently, just making stuff up. And so is it the fringe or is it mainstream if the president of the United States either believes in, supports these things for his realistically or not? I don't know. Who knows what he actually thinks?
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, this is a guy who sort of rode to political prominence on the back of, birtherism, which is an absurd conspiracy theory. If someone's, basically, gets his first, his feet wet in the political arena on a conspiracy theory and then becomes president, that certainly signals to me that conspiracism is mainstream. I think we're living in a time where almost like Alex Jones is a centrist now, and then QAnon is more of the fringe. I think that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Alex Jones. What is his connection with and belief in QAnon? Does he support that shit? Do they support each other? What's the deal with those? With Alex Jones and QAnon? That's
a good question. So Alex Jones was initially on board with QAnon, and so was Jerome Corsi, who was an InfoWars correspondent. But what happened was that early on, as they tried to get on board the Q train, the Q basically called them out as like patriots, so people who are just sort of hopping onto the patriots, who are just hopping on the movement for the sake of money, and that's when Alex Jones declared that actually Q was compromised and that Q wasn't good anymore. And so as a consequence, Alex Jones became sort of antagonistic towards Q. And then a lot of QAnon followers have also become antagonistic towards Alex Jones. They believe they believe that he is a sort of a Mossad agent, and that he is not actually the sort of the truth teller that a lot of Alex Jones fans think he is.
Wow, what a weird two worlds to be torn between.
I mean, in truth, this happens a lot. The conspiratorial worlds, because they are paranoid people, they wind up doing a lot of infighting.
Yeah, I imagine so. You mentioned getting your feet wet in politics with birtherism is interesting, but also just staying with the conspiracy theories about the Obamas. I wanted to ask you about this one because it was so deeply offensive. Like, I am a complete, I admit, sycophant for the Obamas, but specifically for Michelle Obama. I just watched her documentary. I love her. I think she's a great role model. I think she's an amazing human being. And one of the theories about her is that she is not a woman. And I hear that a lot. My mom has heard that a lot. It's so deeply, obviously offensive, and I'm not even going to humble it with even talking about its truth. But how much of that comes from QAnon, that Michelle Obama is not a woman, or anywhere else?
Yeah.
How do you believe that?
Yeah, is weird and absurd. I mean, I believe all this is that this connects. They're trying to connect the people who they don't like, which is the Obamas, to something that they also don't like. In this case, it would be queerness or trans identities, and so in their view, they think that these sorts of identities are so offensive. They even think it's satanic. They just accuse anyone they don't like of having these identities. Yeah, it is deeply gross and offensive.
But the other thing is, I did not realize this, but certainly with QAnon at least, there are roots in evangelical Christianity, and they see the world and kind of that there's going to be something similar to the rapture, and they quote Bible passages a lot. What is the relationship between Christianity or evangelical Christianity and these conspiracy theories, specifically with the QAnon?
Yeah. I mean, evangelical Christians, and their sort of their belief in a rapture, I say, really kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of the QAnon worldview, because it is very similar in the belief that there is, behind the scenes, behind the sort of the day-to-day politics that we see, there is a profound battle going on between the cosmic forces of good and evil, and only you and sort of your other people are kind of privy to it. I mean, a lot of like Q drop decodes, they sound a lot like evangelicals trying to decode the book of Revelation, and sort of making sense of what the end times are going to be like. Yeah, I mean, another aspect of the rapture is the belief that the sort of the good sort of Christians who have been saved by Jesus will be separated from the rest of the heathens, and this sort of mirrors the QAnon belief in the storm of mass arrest. They call it the storm. This belief that one day there is going to be a massive day of reckoning in which all the evil deep state people in the cabal that they don't like in Hollywood and media and Washington will all be rounded up and sent to Guantanamo Bay or possibly executed or possibly sent to military tribunals, that there will just be a day in which the evil will be cleansed from the earth. And that kind of narrative just really resonates with the evangelicals.
Scary and depressing. Now, what is their view on Donald Trump? He is with them, right?
Of course. Yeah, Donald Trump. Yeah, they think that. Yeah, Donald Trump is not only they think that he is basically saving the country and the world as part of a decades-long plan to get rid of the deep state. I think that everything that we're seeing right now, him being elected, wasn't a curious fluke in history, but rather part of an elaborate plan to take down the deep state, and he is the savior of everyone.
And that there is somebody or more than one person working directly with Trump that is communicating as Q itself.
Yeah, they believe that close to Donald Trump there is a team of high-level military intelligence officials known as Q Team, and they are basically releasing information about this secret war that Donald Trump is battling with the deep state behind the scenes on these image boards, and the current image board that Q is on is called 8kun, and they're just these posts, and they're very cryptic. But Q and the followers believe that by decoding these posts, then sort of they all have their individual sort of weird, nonsensical decoding methods, that they can sort of understand what's really going on behind the scenes and what the mainstream media isn't telling us.
Okay, so I think that one of the most interesting and fascinating developments, of course, is that the pandemic and coinciding. It's perfect for the anti-vax movement. Not perfect for, I don't know what the word would be, but you've obviously heard and probably talked a lot about a lot of these conspiracy theories with Bill Gates and vaccines and more. And so how has the QAnon movement seen the pandemic? Because I think I read that you said they're supposed to be all knowing and be able to predict everything, but they didn't predict this. Donald Trump didn't predict this. And so what does that say about their all-knowing power?
Yeah, that's interesting. The Q never warned about, a pandemic. And in fact, a lot of QAnon followers, as a consequence, they were lulled into believing that this was not going to be that big of a deal until Donald Trump was forced to address it as a serious national crisis. But yeah, that actually interesting. That caused a few QAnon followers to express frustration and even doubt with Q, because how could Q possibly miss the biggest worldwide news event of our lifetimes? But they all wound up back on the Q train, believing again, because frankly they don't have anywhere else to go. But I think that the perspective that they wound up going with on the pandemic is that this was a Chinese bioweapon that was secretly designed to hurt Donald Trump's chances in the upcoming election and help Joe Biden. So it's again, they all tie it back to a conspiratorial explanation. Everything that you can see is a deep state plot.
And you could see Trump absolutely loving that theory, and running with it.
Yeah. I don't think he's endorsed that extreme of a view quite yet. But yeah, they see that as everything as the product of design. They say there are no coincidences over and over again. So even this pandemic, which no one could have possibly predicted, they think was just sort of engineered by evil people behind the scenes.
Well, you say they don't have anywhere else to go, and I wonder how often people that are deep into the world of conspiracy, true believers, how often they get out of the cult.
It does happen. It does happen. There's a subreddit called QAnon Casualties, and it's dedicated to people who have loved ones who have fallen into QAnon, and they have some success stories of people who got out. The problem is that if you are very, very deep into QAnon and then you realize that it's bunk and you've been wasting your time and this is not worth it anymore, and you've been deluded and misled, what happens is that you are people usually leave quietly. They don't announce it because, understandably, it's embarrassing to admit that you've been duped. This is something that's very, very humbling. So, understandably, people aren't very eager to announce it, but it is something that does happen.
Is there any prescription anecdote that you have ever seen worked? Is there anything, because I've read that there's a lot of study or research in that folks who believe hardcore into, say, a conspiracy theory, specifically we're talking about, when given all of the accurate information, it's like on climate change, from actual scientists, they end up believing in their theories even stronger. So reason and knowledge and data doesn't convince them. So that doesn't work. Maybe it does. But what then does? Shaming and ridicule probably doesn't work. But I'm at a point where there's some, people in our community that buy into this shit, and we know them, and I'm not willing to endure it anymore, and I don't want to allow it to be normalized. So I've called them out in as many ways as I can, and it's super uncomfortable, but that's just the way I'm handling it. I don't think they're going to change, but I am going to say what you're doing is dangerous and it's not normal. It should never be seen as. Yeah. I don't know if it's effective.
I believe in certainly asserting the truth and sort of asserting, what is dangerous and what is delusional. I'm definitely in favor of that. But one thing that's important to remember is that you can't reason someone out of a belief they were never reasoned into. It's like you can. I think debunking the beliefs of QAnon followers is fun, or interesting. I think it's a sort of a useful exercise if anyone's curious. But at the same time, I realize that if someone is deeply invested in the belief, there are mole children who are bred underground in New York City and they're being rescued by the military, like appealing to evidence isn't going to dissuade them because they didn't believe it because of evidence. You're using the wrong tool. I think that, everyone sort of believes or has a different sort of reason that they buy into this nonsense. But I think that if you are someone that knows someone who believes in QAnon, you're concerned about them. The only thing that you can sort of do is to continue being there and don't let them get too alienated and isolated because of this QAnon belief. And then hopefully they'll see their way out.
That's what I was going to ask you next, is if you see somebody starting to buy into this. I had some listeners saying, hey, man, have you seen this documentary? I don't even want to see these documentary say their names on the show necessarily. I'm not sure what the best tactic is, but, it's like I don't want to give them attention because people are vulnerable, and these documentaries are often very well done. So 2 questions. One, what do you say to somebody who seems like they might be starting to go down that path? What are the red flags? And 2, how effective are these documentaries at really converting people? Because the production quality is great. The narrative is great. They connect all these dots. And a lot of people are easily convinced by these documentaries that are mostly on YouTube because of how well they're done and the case they lay out. I think I asked 2 questions there. Sorry.
Yeah. It's like my only advice is that, the thing is, the problem with you're always reluctant to give advice on how to treat people who are falling into this, because this is honestly it's a mental health question, and I'm simply not a mental health professional. I would refer you to this cult expert. His name is Stephen Hassan. He works with these sorts of issues. He's helped a lot of people get out of other cults like Scientology. I think he would be a better resource for those sorts of questions.
I read about him in prepping for you, and if I'm not mistaken, he was himself in a cult and got out.
Yes,
that right?
That's right. He was the Mooney. He was in the Unification Church for years, and it took basically him getting into an accident and sort of being confined to a hospital before realizing that he had been brainwashed and duped, and he decided that he wanted to regain control of his mind again, and that's when he started researching these sorts of brainwashing techniques that fooled him.
So let me restate that question a little bit more concise, which is what are the most influential recruiting tools to steal these people's brains? Is it because I feel like the videos on YouTube are responsible for a lot of it. Is there any way to apportion blame or responsibility to the sources of where it begins?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the newest tactic that QAnon followers have used in order to gain more believers into the fold in 2020 has been turning to these slickly produced YouTube videos, and this is a lot more effective than sort of the text Q drops on 8kun, because they give a feeling of sort of like professionalism. They seem a little bit more like, the kind of like TV productions that they might be used to when they're just sort of watching movies for
Dateline or something.
Yeah, it's slick. So it gives people this sort of this the total nonsense, this sort of veneer of respectability.
Right. There's an air of credibility to them, and they seem super convincing. Yeah.
It is weird. It's like, it feels like the only trick that they needed to, sort of dress up this nonsense is like good quality lighting and framing of, someone's face. And then that's enough to make people believe that it's, that the information coming from is credible.
Yeah. For real. Yeah, for sure. So, going back to just the idea of how fringe is it, what do you know, and do you guys track for the podcast or, for your work, what politicians may be trafficking in this stuff? Are there any House Republicans, I don't think there's any Democrats, or senators that have in any way trafficked in this type of QAnon conspiracy theory? Because I argue they're mostly conspiracy theorists based on climate change. But in terms of this stuff, is there anybody in the House that's buying into it, that has brought it up, that is retweeting it, that is talking about it?
Well, yeah, there's actually one in particular. Is Congressman Paul Gosar, who is he has quote tweeted a couple of QAnon accounts. Just yesterday, Senator Ted Cruz quote tweeted a tweet that contained the hashtag QAnon, but he wound up deleting that. So that may have been an error on his part.
Bridge too far.
I think that he realized he didn't want to have to deal with that. So, I mean, the fact they deleted it, I'll be honest, is a little bit encouraging to me, because it signals that there's still, at least the senator's office, or maybe the senator himself, realizes that there is still a political or social cost, at least for him, for promoting this nonsense, and he doesn't want to be associated with it. As long as there's still people high up who back away or sort of from this kind of nonsense, then at least we can be confident that isn't totally mainstream quite yet.
Well, I gotta say, your podcast that you do with two other guys is, I actually wish it doesn't exist. I wish. Number one, I wish it didn't exist. Number two, I wish there wasn't enough content for you to keep doing it. But sadly, it's needed, and sadly, there's enough content. How often do you guys do the podcast?
So yeah, we do 2 episodes a week. We have one regular episode, and then we also have a premium episode that we put behind a paywall for people who subscribe to our Patreon. So yeah, we do two shows a week.
It's QAnon Anonymous.
Yes, QAnon Anonymous. We explore the different beliefs and sometimes just sort of adjacent beliefs, or we also explore the reality to a lot of these dimensions, because I think that this is one reason why people get sucked into like QAnon. Like they're outraged, for example, that Jeffrey Epstein was able to abuse so many underage girls for years, and he didn't get the justice he deserves, and that feeling of injustice can make people crazy, and it gets them sucked into these sorts of these false promises.
He is dead.
He is dead. Some QAnon people actually don't believe he's dead, but yeah, he is dead. But the fact that he was he was prosecuted for this in the mid 2000s, and he got a slap on the wrist. It was like a few months of house arrest, basically.
Yeah, that I followed that whole story and covered it here as well. But the thing that you've said this a couple times, and a thing that kind of makes me so frustrated. It's like they're aggrieved. They're upset about something. I know some of them, are really upset because they believe in a lot of either they or their loved ones might have been victims of child abuse of some sort. And so, a lot of this is about some, cracking down on fictional pedophile rings or whatever, sexual, child trafficking and so on. But the idea of that anger and that grievance, I get it. I understand that. It resonates, I think, with a lot of different people all over. But if that were true, you would think that every single black person in America would buy into this stuff. Like, if we're going to talk about who's been the most aggrieved, and certainly there's been a lot of things that have been done to black folks, like the Tuskegee experiment, that makes them distrustful of government and medicine and so on. And I know there's probably a disproportionate amount of people of color who do buy into things. But if it's just about injustice, then you would think minorities especially would be the leading believers in this. But it's my understanding that it's really not. It's evangelical Christians. It's right wing. Isn't it overwhelmingly white? Is there any way to quantify that?
Yeah, is mostly, but not exclusively white. I mean that is an excellent point. I will say this, is that I think that a sense of aggrievement can sort of increase with a sense of entitlement, because well said. Because the more entitled you feel, then you become a lot more sensitive to aggrievements, because you think that small slights are sort of big tragedies.
That's really well said. Great answer. All right, man. I really appreciate your time. I couldn't recommend your podcast higher to my listeners if they're interested in this issue, especially if they've unfortunately lost a loved one to these theories. Is that a fair way? I mean, that's the way I've been framing it. You've lost somebody to this, because you really do often lose them as a member of your family or your friends.
That is definitely a fair way of putting it, because a lot of these people, they it's not just sort of a passive hobby that they do privately. It's all consuming, and it chews away at other aspects of a person's life, like their relationships or their career. So it is losing someone. It's tragic.
Well, definitely listen to the podcast. Keep up the great work. Follow Travis on Twitter, and I'll have all this in the show links. I can't thank you enough for joining me today, and keep up the good work. And like I said, it's a backhanded compliment, but unfortunately your work is super valuable, and unfortunately now more than ever. So
thank you so much, Peter.
All right, Travis. He called me Peter. Always sounds weird to me. Peter. All right, that's it. That's all I got for you today. Thank you to Kenneth C. Davis. Thank you to all of the listeners and subscribers who joined me for the live taping of that interview. We'll try to do that every week. Who would you like to hear? And thank you specifically to a listener named Brady, who's been listening, like I said, at the very top for over 10 years. And he said that his brother, by the way, is a musician and uses this. He mentioned that I've been saying "you're not alone" at the end of every show. And a lot of people are using that phrase. I think it's really important to remind people. He said, "You've been using the, quote, 'you are not alone' phrase a lot lately. I thought I'd pass along my little brother's song he wrote called Just That. I'm happy to peddle my brother's talents and thought it would go perfectly with one of your famous monologues that we all love so much." Well, I don't know if I have too many famous monologues, but I appreciate the flattery. And just for that, I'm going to go out on your little brother's song. Check it out. Trevor Gibney's "You Are Not Alone," available on SoundCloud. I'll link to it in the show notes as well. Thank you very much, Brady. Thank you, all of you. And I'll talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up.
To the dark, while fearful of the light, the hardening of a heart.